Okay, we're going to move on to the second question now. This is another question now. Right. This relates to the public sector employment and spending. Obviously, there's quite a tension looking forward in terms of the burden of costs in this particular area. And there are a couple of additional questions that people have asked but didn't want to ask the question themselves. We're led to believe that we have now reached a point where there are more public than private sector jobs. Is this a sustainable position? And if not, what are the steps that your party believe is intelligent in order to reduce public spending and to address this issue? I'll direct that towards Barry Jones. Barry.
Okay. Is it a sustainable position? It could be. It depends on what these, what the job holders are doing. In a lot of areas, it matters remarkably little to the economy whether the services are delivered by the public sector or the private sector. One of the changes that happened in the 80s was the enforced privatisation of things like school cleaning and hospital cleaning. I don't think, in fact, that it mattered a great deal whether those jobs were provided by the public sector or the private sector. They were still actually being paid for by taxes. So it's not a matter of what's where the people are employed. It is actually a matter of how are those jobs financed. If the jobs are financed by a revenue stream outside taxation, and the number of jobs in the public sector are, then it doesn't matter whether they're in the public sector or the private sector. If the jobs are financed purely from a taxation stream, it doesn't matter whether they're in the public sector or the private sector. But you actually have to look at the sort of balance. And I think it's not really who is the legal employer, but how it's being paid for.
But there is nevertheless pressure to reduce public spending overall, isn't there?
Yes.
And I suppose that's really the building question around what that agenda is going to mean in terms of the effect perhaps on the balance of.
Yes, I think that they are in fact separate items. It clearly is important to reduce public spending because there is an unsustainable difference between income and expenditure, and there is a limit to the amount that can be in which taxation can be used to rebalance that equation. So yes, there will have to be a reduction in public spending, but I don't think that employment, the legal employer, is the only determinant.
Denzil Coulson.
Right, well, in terms of the public sector, we obviously have a problem where we have a lot of managers directing how health and education spending should be done. Certainly one of the things that we will do is that in the NHS we try and get rid of the excessive management in the structure and make sure that there is a redistribution of funding, so you have more nurses and doctors employed where they are needed. Now, there is going to be pain in the public sector. We have to implement a pay freeze and even pay reductions to try and keep people in jobs and redeploy them, because you know, one has to bear in mind that if you are making savings and making positions redundant, etc., there'll be costs involved. People put in the dole queue if they can't find other positions. So we have to make these decisions very carefully in terms of where and what public spending cuts have to be made. It's not a sustainable position as we are, I totally agree. The public sector pensions is an area that has to be looked at seriously, because the pensions are more generous than what you have in the private sector. And I do believe that no area of public spending should be off limits in terms of the pain that has to be done to make sure that the deficit is brought up under control. Because one of the things that I've always said at any meeting or anybody who I speak to is that people will only accept austerity if it is fairly shaped. And that is important here. And that is our fairness agenda. and that's why we're being honest about it with the public, that things and difficult decisions have to be made, and as long as it is fair, as long as people are carrying their fair share of the burden, and that certain people are not carrying a greater burden than others, that is important.
I think unemployment today reached, what was it, 2.7 million people. Youth unemployment is at record levels, and both of those are deeply worrying. But the direct answer to the question, is this a sustainable position, is no, because it is the private sector that pays the wages of the public sector. And we have to understand that those who create things and make things are those who pay the jobs of all of the rest of us, like members of Parliament, who support them. And so we've got to change that round. I agree that we have to have a public sector pay freeze next year. Maybe we'll have to go further. Maybe we'll have to have a public sector pay reduction, but that remains to be seen. I would suggest it would be a thoroughly bad thing to take money out of the private sector by imposing the tax on jobs, the national insurance increase that is coming down the track next year if the Labour Party wins power again. And possibly, although I'm not sure about this, if the Lib Dems are in coalition with the Labour Party, because the Lib Dems, I think, have said that they disapprove of it, but they're not going to stop it. There's something else that we need to do, and here again I agree with Denzil. We've got to reduce the numbers of bureaucrats, the people who check on everybody else, the quangos, the entire size of Whitehall, and you will be pleased to hear that we've got to reduce the number of members of Parliament. We do have rather too many of them at the moment. David Cameron has suggested we should reduce those by 10%. I personally believe that that is a good start, and we could maybe go further. But we've got to cut the pensions of the richest public sector people. We've got to bring forward the time when we all begin to retire at the age of 66, because we're all living longer and healthier, and so there's a lot of work to be done, and it's got to be done soon.
Thank you very much.
Can I,
please?
Yes, I think that the National Health Service has done itself no favours by having a serious outbreak of grade title inflation. I have a friend who goes by whose job goes by the title, I think it's Service Delivery Manager. I said, oh, how many staff have you got? Well, actually, I haven't got any. Well, what do you do? Well, actually, she does the coordination of the complaints. The complaints coordinator would be a much better title. So she then appears in telephone directories as a manager, but she's not.
Yes, I just want to respond to James' point about the national insurance. If you reverse the national insurance rise, where are you going to find the money from? Unless you increase VAT. Now, my concern is that is not a burden fairly shared. So that would be my concern. Yes, obviously national insurance rise is not desirable, but the question is, where would that additional money come from? Because you'd have a shortfall of about 13.5 billion.
I think it's important.